7 years is a long time to carry a scar without knowing whose hands closed it. I have a mark on the inside of my left wrist, a thin pale ridge no wider than a finger. My healers at Kethavorn have examined it more than once. They told me it was clean work, whoever did it. No drag, no ragged edge, no infection, which would have been remarkable given where they pulled the arrow from deep in the lateral muscle, angled up from below. Whoever treated that wound did it in the dark, by feel as much as sight, and they did it well enough that I kept the arm. I did not remember her face. I remembered almost nothing of that night. I had been riding back from a reconnaissance along the Dunville border, 2 men down, the third barely in his saddle, and I had taken the arrow somewhere in the last hour before the valley. By the time my horse found a barn, instinct or luck or something I no longer call either, I was not fully conscious. I remembered a lamp being lit. I remembered a voice, low and unhurried, telling me to be still. I remembered a hand on my wrist, pressing steady and without panic, and the extraordinary cold that came when the arrow was drawn. After that, the fever took me, and I was gone for what must have been a full night and half a day. When I woke, I was alone. Clean bandaging on the wound, water within reach, and the barn empty. My horse had been watered and fed. My 2 men, it turned out, had found shelter half a mile on and had come back for me by mid-morning, and I was already past the worst of it. We never found who had tended me. The farm showed signs of a family, a woman's garden, 2 pairs of boots by the door smaller than a man's, but the house was closed and quiet, and I was in no condition to knock. My men wanted to leave before anyone could report us on the wrong side of the border. We rode. I thought about it afterward, in the way that you think about something you cannot resolve, not with grief exactly, but with a persistent, unfinished feeling, like a sentence that ends before its last word. I owed someone my life, and I did not know their name. I told my steward to make discreet inquiries in Dunville. Nothing came of it. The families near the old wood road were numerous, the farms scattered, and no one admitted to sheltering the Alpha King on a night when the border was technically closed. I did not press. The debt sat in me instead, unnamed. 7 years. I rode into Dunville in the 2nd week of the harvest month, not for old reasons but for new ones. There had been a territorial dispute simmering along the eastern border of the valley for 3 seasons, grazing rights, water access, 2 packs who shared a river and did not share a temperament, and it had reached the point where I needed to sit across a table from the border lords and say things that would not be ignored. My chancellor had been twice already. Twice they had agreed, and twice the agreement had not held. This required the Alpha King himself, which meant it required me, and so I came. I do not usually look at crowds. I have learned not to over the years. When you are the Alpha King riding into any settlement, faces blur into a single expression of cautious attention, and holding individual eye contact with strangers on entry is more trouble than it's worth. I ride through, I acknowledge the alderman or the pack leader or whoever comes forward, and I get on with business. I do not know why I looked at her. She was standing at the edge of the square, not pressing forward the way most of the crowd had, not drawing back either. She was simply standing, watching, her arms at her sides, a cloth bag over her shoulder in the manner of someone who had been somewhere and was now returning from it, and had stopped here because the Alpha King's procession was in the way of going wherever she meant to go next. She was not dressed for ceremony. She was not dressed to be noticed. There was dried mud on the hem of her skirt, which meant she had been in the lower fields or the river path that morning. Her hair was pulled back simply. Her eyes, when they met mine across the square, were the color of river water in late autumn, green and gray both, neither one. She did not look away. Most people look away. Not from fear, Dunville had no quarrel with me, but from the ordinary reflex of someone who has just accidentally caught a king's eye and would prefer not to explain why. She did not have that reflex. She looked at me steadily, calmly, with an expression I could not immediately read, and then her gaze dropped to my left hand where it rested on the reins, and something moved across her face that I had no name for. Recognition, perhaps. But that could not be right, because I had never been to Dunville before, not officially, and I did not know her. My wolf, who had been quiet in that particular settled way he had maintained for 7 years, did something unusual. I need to explain what I mean by quiet. My wolf had not been withdrawn or dormant. He was present, as he had always been, in the way that a fire in the grate is present, warmth, awareness, the steady sense of another consciousness inside my own. But he had not surged toward anything. He had not pulled toward a mate. My counsel had been suggesting for the last 3 years that I choose someone, for political reasons as much as personal ones, and I had looked at several women my chancellor considered suitable and felt nothing that could honestly be called a bond. My wolf observed these meetings with complete indifference. I had begun to think, in the way that one reaches a quiet, resigned conclusion after enough years, that perhaps the bond simply was not coming. That some alpha kings lived and died and chose their Luna from duty and warmth rather than destiny. It was not a thing I mourned loudly. I mourned it the way you mourn a sentence that never found its last word. When my eyes found her across the square, my wolf went very still and then settled. Not the absence of motion, the opposite, the way a compass needle swings and then at last finds north and stops. He did not surge. He did not howl. He simply oriented, with a certainty I had never felt before, and the direction he oriented toward was the woman standing at the edge of the square with river mud on her hem, looking at my left wrist. I pulled my horse to a stop. My captain misread it as a greeting to the alderman, which was convenient, and the alderman stepped forward to receive it. I went through the motions of the formal welcome. I had done it enough times that the words came without my full attention, and when I looked back to the edge of the square, the woman was gone. I found her 3 hours later. Not by design. I was walking the perimeter of the square after the initial meeting with the alderman, getting the sense of the village before the formal council the next day, which was a habit I had developed early in my rule and had never abandoned. A king who sits only in meeting rooms understands nothing about the places he governs. So I walked with 2 of my men at a discreet distance, and I turned down the lane beside the grain store, and there she was. She was examining a bundle of dried herbs hung from the eaves of a narrow building that turned out, on closer inspection, to be an apothecary, or what served as one in a village this size. She had her back to me, sorting through the bundles with the unhurried attention of someone who knew exactly what she was looking for and was in no particular rush to find it. And the sight of her, that same quality of complete settled calm she'd had in the square, stopped me in the lane the way very few things stopped me. I said, "You were in the square earlier." She turned around, no alarm, no start, as though she had known I was there. "I was," she said. She had a low, even voice. The same voice, I realized, from a long way underneath conscious thought that had told me to be still. I did not know that yet, not fully. It surfaced and then sank again, the way something large moves just below water and is gone before you can name it. "Do we know each other?" I asked. It was not the kind of question I was in the habit of asking. I was the Alpha King. I did not need to ask whether people knew me. But I was not asking about me. She was quiet for a moment, looking at me with that river-green gaze, calm and careful and measuring. "No," she said at last, and then very slightly, "Not exactly." "Not exactly," I repeated. "Your horse chose well," she said, which made no sense to me. And before I could ask what she meant, she said, "I'm sorry. I should let you get back to your men." She looked past me briefly, to where my captain and the other man had stopped at the lane's entrance, conspicuously not looking at us. "You have a council tomorrow." "I do," I said. "What is your name?" Another pause, shorter this time. "Sira Mallow," she said. "My father kept the farm at the end of the old wood road before he passed. I live in the village now." The old wood road. The phrase caught in me like a hook. "I am sorry about your father," I said, because it was true, and because it was the thing to say, and because some part of me was busy doing something else entirely, turning over the words old wood road in the dark of whatever lived below thought. She nodded. "He was a good man." She adjusted the cloth bag on her shoulder. "Good evening, my Lord Alpha." She turned and walked back into the apothecary, and the door closed behind her, and I stood in the lane for what was probably too long before my captain came to collect me. I did not sleep well that night. It was not the council, though the council was complicated enough. The 2 border lords had a history that went back 40 years, a water rights agreement that had never been properly transcribed, and a shared wolf pack boundary that had shifted 3 times in my father's reign. I had reviewed all of it. I knew what I needed to say. That was not what kept me awake. What kept me awake was the sense of something on the edge of memory, like a word you know and cannot surface. The old wood road, a voice low and even telling me to be still. A hand on my wrist, not gentle exactly, but steady, the steadiness of someone who knew what hands were for and was not afraid to use them. I kept seeing the way her gaze had dropped to my left wrist in the square. By morning I had convinced myself I was constructing a story from almost nothing, the way the mind does when it wants something to be true. She was a village healer's daughter. I had been tended by someone in a barn on the old wood road. These were two facts, not one. The barn had been on a farm, not in the village proper. She lived in the village now. Her father had passed. These pieces fit together in a way that meant nothing necessarily. By morning, I had mostly convinced myself of this. Then I saw her in the council hall. The hall was large enough for the two border lords and their people, the village alderman and his two deputies, and the Alpha King's party, and it was full by the time I entered. Sierra Mallow was seated to the left of the alderman's table, which struck me as unusual. She was not an official. She was not a pack elder or a landholder or anyone with formal standing in the council. I glanced at my chancellor, who checked his papers, and murmured that she was listed as the village healer. Dunville's only working one, apparently, since old Mallow had died 2 years back, and that the alderman included her in councils because she dealt with the river families and the farming households in a way that neither lord had managed. She was the person in this room who actually knew these people. The alderman had been cleverer than I'd given him credit for. I took my seat at the head of the table and opened the council, and I did what I had come to do, laid out the history of the agreement, named the violations on both sides without ceremony, proposed a renegotiated boundary with surveyor's stakes and a written and sealed record this time. I did not shout. I did not threaten. I had found over the years that a room in which the Alpha King is being very quiet and very precise has a particular quality of attention that shouting cannot produce. The two border lords attended to me. They attended to my chancellor when he spoke to the legal history. They made several attempts to redirect the conversation toward each other, which I declined. And then one of them, Lord Harville, the younger of the two, who had the manner of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted from people he considered unimportant, looked at Sierra Mallow and said, with the particular tone of dismissal that does not bother to disguise itself, "Does the healer's opinion have bearing here? This is a territorial matter. I was not aware we required instruction from the Mallow girl." She did not react visibly. She looked at her hands on the table, not cowed, not flinching, but choosing not to take the bait in exactly the way that tells you someone has been choosing not to take that bait for a long time. Something tightened in me. "Lord Harville," I said, and I used the quiet voice, "the healer's opinion has whatever bearing I determine it has. Is that clear?" He colored slightly, nodded. "Good," I looked at Sierra. "Please speak." She looked up, and there was something in her expression that was not gratitude exactly, more like a careful assessment of whether I meant it. And then she spoke, and she was precise and without flourish, the way someone is precise who has spent years saying things clearly to people who would rather not listen. She named the river families on both sides of the boundary. She described which households had grazing on which land, and where the actual water use had shifted over the last 5 seasons. She had the practical facts that no lord and no chancellor carried, because lords and chancellors were not the ones who walked to those households on foot and listened to them. She had been building a case for the families she served, quietly, patiently, over years, in the way that someone builds something when they know it will not be handed to them. When she finished, the room was quiet. Lord Harville was looking at his own hands. I said, "Thank you, Mistress Mallow." And then, to the border lords, "You will have observed that the healer has a rather more detailed knowledge of this border than either of your land agents. I suggest, when the new agreement is drawn, that her account of the current household arrangements be appended as a practical record. My chancellor will see to it." My chancellor was already writing. The council broke for midday, and I stepped out into the yard behind the hall where there was a narrow bench and a wall to put my back against, which was all I generally needed in the middle of a day like this one. One of my men brought me bread and cold meat, and I was eating in the efficient businesslike way of someone who was not particularly thinking about food when Sierra Mallow came through the same door. She stopped when she saw me, a brief pause, and then she moved to go back inside. "Mistress Mallow," I said. She stopped. "Please don't go on my account," I gestured to the yard. "There's room." She stayed. She went to stand by the far wall rather than the bench, which I read correctly as preferring to have her own space, and I did not press. We were quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet between two people who are not uncomfortable, but are deciding what to do with each other. "You handled Harville well," I said. "He's been handling himself badly for 20 years, she said. I have learned to let him do most of the work. I found myself almost smiling, which was not a thing that happened often in the middle of working councils. You were the one he was dismissing this morning, I said. You didn't seem particularly troubled. I have been called the Mallow Girl by Lord Harville since I was 12, she said. I have decided that whether it troubles me is my own business. She said it without bitterness, as a statement of fact and of decision. Sira, I said, and then stopped, because I had not meant to use her given name without permission, and I was not in the habit of that kind of carelessness. She looked at me, not startled, considering. I want to ask you something, I said, and you may decline to answer. A moment, all right. The barn on the old wood road, I said. The farm at the end of it before your father passed. She went very still. 7 years ago, I said, in the autumn, a man was brought in on a horse in the middle of the night, an arrow wound in the left arm. I turned my wrist up on my knee so she could see the ridge of scar tissue in the afternoon light. Was that your father's barn? The yard was quiet. Somewhere past the wall, 2 men from my party were talking in low voices about something that had nothing to do with this. Yes, she said. The word settled in me like something that had been falling for a long time and had finally touched ground. That was you, I said, who tended it. She was quiet for a moment. Then, my father was in the village that night. I was alone on the farm. The horse found the barn. She paused. You were not conscious enough to notice much. I thought it better to let you sleep than to introduce myself. I thought you were gone before I woke. I was by then. I had chores. I did not think, she stopped, chose her words. I did not think you would want it known where you had been. She had been protecting me, even as a stranger. Even without knowing who I was, or perhaps knowing exactly who I was, and choosing discretion anyway. You saved my arm, I said. Possibly my life. I have not been able to repay that debt. I have tried to find who it was, and I couldn't. I didn't do it for repayment, she said simply. There was a man bleeding in our barn. You tend to what's in front of you. I looked at her for a long moment. My wolf was doing that settled thing again, that orientation, that compass needle stillness, and the longer I was in her presence, the more certain, and the more inexplicable it became, certainty without understanding, which was its own particular quality of discomfort for a man who ran a kingdom, and preferred to understand the things he was certain of. That scar, she said quietly, and she nodded at my wrist. I wasn't sure when I saw you in the square. The light was, and it had been a long time, but I thought it might be. It is, I said. It's been 7 years. She looked away briefly at the wall across the yard. Yes, she said, it has. There was something in those 3 words that I could not fully read. A weight, perhaps. The kind that settles in a sentence when someone has been carrying a thing for a long time, and the carrying is so old that it barely shows anymore. I did not ask about it then. The bell above the hall rang the midday hour, and she straightened, and I stood, and we went back inside. The council concluded in the late afternoon. The agreement was reached, which was the thing I had come for, a redrawn boundary with surveyor's stakes, a sealed record, Lord Harville's signature under mine in a position that would remind him, every time he looked at the document, exactly where his authority ranked relative to the Alpha Kings. My chancellor was satisfied. My men were ready to ride back to the Kethavorn Road by morning. I told them I would need 1 more day. My captain did not ask why. He was old enough in his service to me to have learned when questions were wanted and when they were not, and that evening, when I dismissed the last of my men and went walking on the river path south of the village in the early dark, he let me go with only 2 at the far edge of view and did not follow himself. She was there, not waiting for me, I think, or rather, I think she went to that path for reasons of her own, which may have happened to align with the reasons I had for going. The river path was a working path, muddy and practical, running along the bank between the village and the outer farms. She was walking it with the cloth bag on her shoulder again, heading outward. She stopped when she heard me behind her. My Lord Alpha, she said. I asked you not to call me that this morning, I said. I had not, in fact, asked that this morning, but it was true that I wanted it, which was near enough. She turned around. In the near dark, she looked like herself, and also, somehow, like the dark and the river were part of her, the way that people who spend a great deal of time outdoors seem to belong to the places they move through. I'm going out to the Fenwick family, she said. The youngest has a fever. I try to check in the evenings when it goes beyond the third day. I'll walk with you, I said. It was not a question. Not quite. She looked at me for a moment, and whatever she saw in my face seemed to satisfy her, or at least not to give her cause to object, and she turned back toward the path and kept walking, and I fell in beside her. The river ran low and dark to our left. The path smelled of mud and cold grass, and faintly of the herbs in her bag, something clean, like pine resin and dried winter berries. We walked for a few minutes without speaking, which was comfortable in the way that silence between people who have come to some mutual, unspoken understanding is comfortable. You've been here 2 years, I said finally, since your father passed. 3, she said. He died 3 years ago. I had already been living in the village for a year before that. The farm was too large for one person. A pause. He left it to my cousin who works it now. I was already doing what I do. And what you do is the healing. It's what I've always done, she said. My father was the healer here for 30 years. I learned from him. By the time I was 18, there wasn't much he still needed to teach me. You were young when you were tending the farm alone, I said. 7 years ago. I was 22, she said. I was not a child. No, I agreed. You weren't. I thought of the hands on my wrist that night, the precision of them, the complete lack of panic. 22 years old, alone on a farm in the dark with an unconscious stranger bleeding in the barn, and she had simply gotten on with it. I was 29, I said. I have been the Alpha King for 4 years at that point. I was not supposed to be anywhere near the Dunville border. I was supposed to be in Kethavorn. I had ridden out without my full guard because I wanted to see the border situation myself, which my chancellor will tell you is a habit he has not succeeded in breaking, and I nearly paid for it. She made a sound that might, in slightly less controlled circumstances, have been a small laugh. I didn't know who you were, she said. Not at first. Then I saw the ring. The Alpha King's ring. The iron band on my right hand, the one I wore into everything because I did not believe in taking it off for convenience. I saw the ring and I thought, this is the Alpha King of Kethavorn, bleeding in my father's barn, and he is not going to die if I have anything to say about it. She was quiet for a moment. I considered waking my father, but he was in the village, and it was past midnight, and I thought it would be better to simply handle it. Simply handle it, I said, and this time I heard the dryness in my own voice plainly enough. I had handled arrow wounds before, she said. My father's work included the Eastern Militia before he retired from it. I grew up assisting him. Did you tell your father after? A longer pause. No, she said. Why not? She was quiet for long enough that I thought she might not answer. Then, carefully, because I had not decided what I thought about it, and I wanted to decide before I said it to anyone. I did not ask what she meant. I thought I understood it in the oblique and incomplete way that one understands a thing when the evidence is partial but the pattern is suggestive. She had been 22. She had spent a night and most of a day in the company of an unconscious man she could not speak to, tending him, and she had not told anyone afterward. She had kept it for 7 years. That was not nothing. That was the shape of something. We reached the Fenwick farm, a low stone house with a light in the window, and she spent an hour there while I waited in the yard. The night was cold and clear, the kind of cold that smells like coming frost, and I leaned against the stone wall of the outbuilding and looked at the stars and tried to make sense of what was happening to me. My wolf was not trying to make sense of anything. My wolf had arrived at his answer sometime around noon and had been holding it with complete unruffled confidence since then. She came out with the bag lighter and the look of someone who had done a thing well and was not interested in being congratulated for it. The fever broke, she said. He'll be all right. Good, I said. We walked back in the same comfortable silence. Slower now, she was less purposeful in the direction away from something than she was in the direction toward it. The river ran to our right now, the same water but seen from the other side, which changed very little about it. Sira, I said, I want to tell you something. She looked sideways at me in the dark. I came to Dunville to settle a border council, I said. That is why I came, but I am standing in a lane at night with a woman I have been looking for 7 years without knowing I was looking for her, and my wolf, I stopped, found the right word. My wolf has found his north, and I am not in the practice of pretending that hasn't happened when it has. The path was quiet, the river ran. She had stopped walking. I had too without deciding to. 7 years, she said very quietly. He has been still for 7 years, I said, oriented toward nothing, and then I rode into the square today and he settled, pointed, and the direction was you. She was looking at me. In the near dark her face was composed and careful, the way it had been all day, but there was something under it now, something that had been held for a long time and was becoming more difficult to hold. I didn't think, she said slowly, that I would see you again. I thought you had gone and your kingdom was 40 miles north and I had done what I could. I thought that was the end of it. Was it? She was quiet. No, she said at last, very simply. No, it wasn't. We stood there in the lane and the river ran and the moon was high and cold, and something moved between us that I had no name for that was not simply called bond, though it was that, the pull of it like a tide, the sense of completion approaching. I don't need you to decide anything tonight, I said. I am not going to tell you what this means and then demand an answer before the morning. You have had 7 years to carry this alone, and I have had 7 years of not knowing what I was carrying. We can take some time. I looked at her directly. But I am not pretending that I don't know who you are to me, or that I came here and found something that changes everything. I will not do you that discourtesy. She looked at me for a long moment. Something in her eyes was working, some calculation or emotion that was working its way through, and she was letting it. You are nothing like I imagined, she said. What did you imagine? A brief pause, someone who rode away. The words landed quietly, accurately. I rode away not knowing, I said. If I had known, but that sentence could go too many places, and I did not want to make promises for a man I had been 7 years ago who did not have the information I had now. I am not riding away now, I said instead. That is what I can tell you. She looked at me for another moment, and then she began walking again toward the village, and I fell in beside her, and we did not speak for the rest of the way back, but the silence had changed. It had weight and warmth in it now, the weight of something acknowledged at last. The council session the following morning was a formality, signatures, the chancellor's seals, the ritual of 2 lords agreeing in writing to things they had agreed to verbally the day before, which mattered because verbal agreements between those two were worth less than the paper they weren't written on. I sat through it with my full attention on it, which I owed it, and when it was done I received the alderman's gratitude and told my men to make ready to ride by midday. Then I asked the alderman where I might find Sira Mallow. He looked at me with the careful expression of a man who is trying to decide whether to ask a question, decides against it, and tells me she would be at the apothecary in the morning. She was at the apothecary. She looked up when I came through the door into the narrow interior, which smelled of dried plants and iron, and something sweet and dark that I didn't know the name of. You're leaving today, she said. It was not a question. By midday, I said. I wanted to come and say it directly, not through a message. She set down the bundle she had been sorting, looking at me. I will send a formal inquiry, I said, to you and to the alderman as is proper for the village, because I am aware that I am the Alpha King and I am in your village and there is a correct way to do this, and I am committed to doing it correctly. I paused. But I want you to know before the formality what the inquiry will say. She waited. It will say that the Alpha King has reason to believe his fated bond has been found, I said, and that the woman in question is Sira Mallow, healer of Dunville, and that the Alpha King requests the opportunity to spend time in Dunville, and to have Dunville's healer come to Kethavorn when she is willing, and to allow this thing to be what it is, without rushing it or forcing it into a shape it has not yet taken. I stopped. Then, quieter, it will say that the Alpha King knows he is asking this woman to consider a life considerably larger than the one she has, and that he does not take that lightly. The apothecary was very quiet. Somewhere outside, one of my men's horses stamped on the cobbles. You haven't asked, she said. I have not, I agreed. Because I am not certain you are ready to answer yet, and because an answer given before someone has had time to think is not the answer I want. She was looking at me with that river-green steadiness, that quality of measuring and deciding that I had been watching since the square yesterday morning, and had come to understand was not coldness at all, but the characteristic of someone who gave their words the weight they were worth. I have been thinking, she said. Since last night, I did not sleep particularly well. Neither did I. The ghost of a smile. Small, private, the kind that arrives before the person who owns it has decided to allow it. I do not need more time to know what I think, she said. I already know what I think. I have known for 7 years what I think, though I have been telling myself for 7 years that what I think is not relevant because the man who would have made it relevant rode away and did not come back. She paused, let a breath go. He came back. He came back, I said. She looked at me directly. I think you should send your inquiry, she said. And I think when it arrives I will answer it. And I think, another pause, shorter, the kind that means a decision has just been made, I think yes. I stood there in the apothecary in the middle of Dunville, and something in me that had been held at a particular tension for 7 years, a tension so long-standing I had stopped feeling it as tension, and had started feeling it simply as the way things were, released. My wolf exhaled. If wolves can be said to exhale. Good, I said, and then, because I was not entirely sure what else to do with the magnitude of what had just been decided in a room that smelled like dried pine and iron, I will come back. I know, she said. I came back in 3 weeks. The inquiry arrived ahead of me, properly worded, properly sealed, my chancellor's best formal hand, and Sira Mallow answered it in 3 sentences, all of them correct, and the alderman added a paragraph of his own that was more words than 3 sentences and said essentially the same thing. I brought a smaller party this time. No border lords, no council. I came because I had said I would, and because my wolf had not been quiet in the same way since the day I had ridden out of Dunville, and I had learned enough in my years as Alpha King to recognize the difference between the things that could wait and the things that could not. I spent 4 days in Dunville. I slept at the alderman's house and walked the river path in the mornings, and on the 2nd day Sira showed me the eastern farms that had been the subject of the council dispute, walking the boundary herself and pointing out where the stakes had gone in. And on the 3rd evening we sat in the apothecary after she had closed it for the night and talked until very late, not about the bond or the 7 years or any of the large things, but about her father, and about my mother who had died when I was 12, and about what it was like to be 22 and alone on a farm in the dark, and what it was like to be 29 and the Alpha King, and not know whether you were going to keep the arm. On the 4th day I asked her plainly whether she would come to Kethavorn. In what capacity? She said. Not reluctance. It was a genuine question, precise and practical, which I had learned was how she asked everything. As the person I think you are to me, I said. We can call it a visit to the hold, you can see it, you can meet my people, and then you can decide. She came in the 5th week, with the alderman's blessing and a bag of herbs and a practicality about the whole matter that I found, unexpectedly, enormously steadying. Kethavorn Hold is not a small place. It is a high gray hold above a long valley, with a great hall that runs 60 feet from door to fire and a courtyard that rings in the wind, and I have watched many people arrive at it for the first time and feel the weight of what it would mean to belong here. Sira Mallow arrived at it, dismounted, looked up at the gates and said, "Where do your healers keep their stores?" My head healer, Rowan Fitch, showed her. By mid-morning they were arguing companionably about the storage of fresh moss root, which was apparently a topic on which they held opposing views, and Rowan later told me it was the best argument he'd had in a year. She stayed a fortnight. She and Rowan resolved the moss root question in a way that satisfied them both and baffled the dispensary assistant. She walked the hold's packed territory in the mornings with 2 of the older wolves, who had never accepted a stranger so readily. She ate at the high table and was quiet about it, and when my chancellor asked her about the Dunville boundary agreement, she told him, with excellent precision, exactly what the practical situation on the ground was, and he added 3 pages to the formal record. On the last evening, I found her on the high parapet where I went sometimes when I needed to think, standing at the western railing looking out over the valley. She heard me come. She did not turn around. "I like it here," she said. "Good," I said. "It is very large." "It is," I agreed. "I would need to continue the healing work. I would not be content without it." "I know that," I said. "Rowan would be glad to have you. The valley villages need more coverage than one healer can manage." She turned around. The evening light from the west was behind her, which meant she was half in shadow, which meant I could see the shape of her face without seeing her expression, which was an unusual place to be. "I have thought about it," she said. "All fortnight, I have not thought about much else if I'm honest." "And," I said. She stepped out of the shadow into the direct light, so I could see her properly. Yes, she said, it was the same word she had said in the apothecary in Dunville. The same weight to it, the weight of a decision arrived at and spoken plainly. Fully and without reservation, yes. I crossed the parapet and took her hand, and the mate mark burned to life. I had heard it described. Every Alpha King is told what to expect, at least in theory, from the older wolves and the pack lore, and the accounts of those who have lived it before. I had been told that the mark burns at the moment of recognition, that it burns on both, that it cannot be mistaken for anything else. All of that was true. What no description had ever managed to convey was that it did not feel like an event happening to me. It felt like a sentence that had been interrupted 7 years ago, finding its last word. Not sudden and new, completed at last. Her wrist bore the mark where mine did, the twin spiraling pattern at the inside of the left wrist, glowing a brief and fading gold before it settled into its permanent form. She looked at it, and then looked at me. "Oh," she said very quietly. "Yes," I said. She let out a slow breath, and then she laughed, low and sudden and entirely herself, which was not what I had expected at that exact moment, and was precisely the right thing. We returned to Dunville together in the early spring to formally announce the bond to the village and the valley. I had asked my chancellor to prepare the announcement carefully, which was an instruction he always received carefully, but this one I reviewed myself, which was not my usual practice, because this one mattered to me in a way that could not be delegated. The announcement named the bond. It named Sira Mallow of Dunville as my fated mate and the Lunar of Kethavorn. It named the 7 years of the bond's waiting, which I had put in specifically, because it seemed to me that the truth of it was the thing most worth saying. Lord Harville was there. He had been summoned to receive the formal notice of the mate bond, as the senior territorial lord of the valley, which was procedure, and he had come. He bowed first, which I had not required, but which he evidently felt was the right thing to do, looking at Sira Mallow standing beside me in the light of the Dunville Square with the mate mark at her wrist and my ring on her right hand. He bowed, and the 2 land agents behind him bowed, and the alderman bowed, and the pack of the valley bowed, and Sira stood in the middle of all of it with her cloth bag still on her shoulder, which she had brought because there was a family on the East Road she intended to visit on the way back, and she looked at all of them with that river-green steadiness and simply accepted it. She did not take the bag off for the ceremony. I had learned by then not to expect her to. On the evening we returned to Kethavorn for the last time as people returning, and not as people visiting. On the evening this became the place she lived, I took her to the barn. There is no barn at Kethavorn that matches the one on the old wood road, which no longer stands. The farm passed through the cousin's hands, and the old structure came down. But the valley below the hold has 3 barns, and the one at the far end of the eastern field is old and low-roofed and smells of straw and hay, and the particular dark animal warmth that is the same in every barn in every kingdom I have ever stood in. I had no reason for going there except that I wanted to, and I had learned by then that in her company I could be clear about wanting things without needing a reason. She stood in the doorway and looked in, and I stood beside her. "Not the same," she said. "No," I agreed, "but close enough to the feeling." "Yes." She reached across and took my left wrist in her hand, the way she had 7 years ago, both hands, her thumbs along the line of the scar, her grip steady and sure. The mate mark was on the same wrist now, settled and quiet, a permanent silver-gray curve in the lamplight. She held it for a moment, then she let it go. "I did not know," she said, "that night that I was keeping you for myself. I thought I was simply keeping you alive." "Perhaps both were true," I said. She looked up at me. The lamplight was behind me, which meant the light was on her face, which was where I had decided long ago I preferred the light. "Perhaps," she said. And she was smiling now, the full unguarded version of it, the one I had been watching surface in stages since a square in Dunville on a harvest morning. And here it was at last, entirely hers, entirely given and aimed at me. "Come inside," she said, and stepped through the barn door, and I followed her in. The straw was clean, and the rafters were low, and the lamp made a warm circle in the dark. And outside the valley was quiet, and the wolves were quiet, and the mark on my wrist had found the answer it had been pointing toward for 7 years. She did not let me carry her bag. She never did.